As ALGS Year 3 came to an end, it seemed like 3 legends were set to dominate the meta moving forward. Those legends were Catalyst, Horizon, and Bangalore. However, with the new season and encroaching onto ALGS Year 4, and the first few days starting, it appears a new legend had entered the meta, Conduit. What's up, everybody? Burke here with my new analysis series breaking down all things Apex Legends competitive, the meta. In each episode of this series, I'm going to break down different aspects of the Apex Legends Global Series competitive meta. This isn't just confined to Legends, but will also expand to POIs, weapons, attachments, and more. If you're not into Apex Legends competitive, then this can still apply to your ranked and to your pubs matches, but it's going to be much more geared towards analyzing the Apex Legends competitive scene. So if you're a viewer and you enjoy that, or if you're a comp player or a challenger circuit player looking to get a leg up, then this series might be for you. And in today's segment, we're talking about Conduit. In this episode, we're going to talk about why Conduit is meta and the effects that she has over the general play in a lobby. We'll talk about the benefits that Conduit brings to the meta. We'll discuss whether or not Conduit needs to be nerfed and ways in which we could do that, and ways in which you can embrace and counter the Conduit meta. Despite whether or not there's validity to the argument that Conduit should not be in the meta, or Conduit is simply not providing enough value to be in the meta, which we'll dive into a little bit later, Conduit is currently seeing a 48% pick rate. Now, while that is not as high as some of the other meta legends such as Horizon, Catalyst, and Bangalore, I would argue that Conduit is seeing some of the most impact across the professional play. So let's talk about why she's meta, why she's being picked by these teams. And the strongest argument for why she gets picked up is her tactical Radiant Transfer. Radiant Transfer, as you likely know, has the ability to temporarily regenerate shield health for you and one teammate. And the biggest value that this tactical provides is what we call uptime. Uptime in terms of fights is your ability to stay in the fight without having to back up, whether it's to pop a shield battery or to reload. In this situation, it denies your need to pop a battery because you are regenerating this temporary shield at a much faster rate, allowing for you to re-peak in a matter of seconds. In addition to this, the Radiant Transfer also provides the entire team extra team HP. For example, if a team is running triple blue armors with a Conduit, they would have a total effective HP of 345 shield health, whereas a triple purple armor would have 300 shield HP. Even though 3 blue armors would total 325 shield health, because they get another 75 for 2 different teammates in shield health, they have an effective 345 shield HP, which means that a triple blue team with a Conduit is going to be better most situations than a triple purple team without her. One of the reasons that uptime is so important is because of the ability for team firing. When you're in a fight, it's not as simple as just 1v1, 1v1, and 1v1. These 3 players are not fighting in a vacuum. These 3 players are fighting together against another 3 players. If a teammate has to back up to pop a battery or to reload or something like that, then that means that he is not dealing damage with his teammates. So if someone you're shooting at has 200 HP, and you are firing just yourself, you have to deal 200 damage to that person. And in some situations, that means hitting every single shot of your gun. However, if you have 3 teammates in a fight and you are all dealing damage to the same person, then you have to only deal about 66 damage, which means that the amount of shots you actually have to hit per mag is significantly reduced. The benefit of team firing in a fight is significant, and the ability to keep your teammates in a fight means that you're able to team fire all 3 of the teammates while they might have to back up. If you have to back up to pop a shield battery, then the amount of damage that has to be done per mag for your teammates is nearly doubled. For example, if you're fighting a team with purple shields and you team fire one of their players, if all 3 of you are shooting at the same opponent, then you have to deal about 66.6 damage per person against that opponent, which is not a lot of the shots in your magazine, which means that if you are very accurate, they'll get down before you've even finished your mag. And if you're not accurate, it means that you're very likely to still knock that person. However, if one of you gets cracked and has to pop a shield battery, that means that 2 of you are shooting at that person instead of 3. And for 200 HP, that means that each of you now has to do 100 damage, which is almost double the amount that you would have had to deal if you had all 3 of you shooting at that person. This is one of the biggest reasons why uptime is important, is because it gives you the advantage in a fight of being able to down an opponent quicker. or at least being able to crack them to where they have to back up, giving you an advantage of a 3 versus 2 or a 3 versus 1. Conduit provides that utility of staying in the fight longer so that you have more opportunities to gain an advantage on your opponent through team firing or through outnumbering the opponents that are currently in the fight. Now, there are a lot of discussions on whether or not Conduit needs to be used for this utility. TSM coach Raven has brought up the discussion of uptime and states that there are plenty of other ways to achieve uptime. For example, better attachments like better magazines, which allow you to shoot your gun for longer, better armors, which just allow you to stay in the fight longer simply by the fact that you have more HP, which is a little bit more reliant on crafter farming and farming up your evos through crafters, or having long-range weapons that allow you to peek in the early game without having to take too much risk, or just simply having larger damage per magazine guns, which is why we've seen TSM run AAR or Marksman AR in their first 2 days of ALGS. We've seen this rejection of Conduit be successful, with seeing TSM be in 3rd place overall across all 3 match days, but even Raven concedes that this is a loot differential that is achieved specifically with better POIs, allowing for better loot. If you don't have the ability to achieve better loot, then you're already at a disadvantage anyway, and Conduit is merely a needs for catching up. Conduit is needed to secure those better POIs. In order to contest, you have to run that Conduit off drop because you're getting 100 extra shield HP off drop. If you're landing at the same POI with another team that does not have a Conduit, then you have the ability to regenerate your white shield for 50 HP and a teammate's shield for extra 50 HP. That's a significant advantage, which means that they had to run Conduit themselves to get the POIs that they wanted to not be able to run Conduit. Simply by the amount of POIs per team, most teams can't rely on better loot without taking fights either through contests or on the rotate. Aside from passive crafter farming, which would mean that they would have to avoid fights in the early game, potentially running a recon legend simply to hit recon scans and dodge teams on their rotates, hitting crafter on the way in and finding a spot in zone if they're lucky. Most of these teams that are playing edge playstyles or are forced to play edge POIs are going to need to play Conduit to stay relevant and to keep up with teams that have better POIs. If they want to secure those POIs for themselves, then they're going to need to play Conduit to get them as well. Teams that can't or won't contest for better POIs will need to play Conduit just to catch up, while teams with better edge POIs will still need to run Conduit or risk being run down by a Conduit team in a weaker POI. This is because they still have a stronger off-drop advantage in fights. This pulls back to my discussion about the blue shields with Conduit versus purple shields without. If a team that's landing stacks big mods such as Optic Gaming somehow manages with crafter and loot to get triple purple before leaving their POI, a team from Dome could get triple blue armors, rotate down, and be at an advantage in fights if the team in stacks mod does not have Conduit. This forces even good edge POIs to have to run Conduit so that they can't be run down by weaker POIs that are. This is why Optic struggled in day 1 of ALGS, because they were not adopting Conduit, and they simply could not keep up with the other teams that are. Because they leaned so heavily towards an edge playstyle due to the POI that they land in, they were forced to adapt, having to swap their playstyle to Conduit for their next match day, in which situation they did much better. In addition to this benefit, Radiant Transfer also provides saving shield resources and benefits your shield economy during the game. If you are in a good position in zone, you are able to peek and re-peek using just your Radiant Transfer to replenish your shields. We see a lot of teams, even in the first few days, starting to abuse this mechanic. In situations where edge teams were forced to play zone due to a zone pool that pulls towards their own POIs, we saw edge teams that would run Conduit playing zone and using the Radiant Transfer rather than popping shield batteries to deal damage and level up their Evo armors. This is significantly beneficial for their shield economy because instead of having to pop shield batteries or cells every time they took damage, they could simply wait until the Radiant Transfer returned, use it again, wait for it to regenerate their shield, peek again, and get cracked for the temporary HP, not their own shields. And if you were in a safe position to do so, then you could do this for a long time and level up your Evo armors with something like a 30-30, continuously re-peeking and re-peeking every time your Radiant Transfer returned, leveling up your armors, even if you were forced to play zone with a Conduit. This is similar to the Watson advantage, where Watson Pylon regenerates your shields over time, but the benefit that Conduit has that's different is that you and one teammate can continuously do this. Whereas Watson Gen has a cap to how much shield it can regenerate, Conduit is only limited to her cooldown and regenerates both you and your teammates' shields each time that you pop a Conduit tactical. The other reason that Conduit is so effective is her ultimate Energy Barricade is a really effective zoning tool, which can allow for easier resets and slow third parties for edge teams in the early to mid game. In addition to this, it's also a strong endgame zoning tool. With 250 pylon HP each, it can cross an entire end zone, and it can prevent pushes into buildings as well. With 10 damage per tick, it's a very strong hit, as well, making it not so easy to push through. Lastly, in addition to this, being a support legend allows for resets for failed early to mid-game fights, which decreases risks when fighting. This means that Conduit teams can be a little bit more risky in the early game and take fights they normally wouldn't take, simply because as long as one of them gets out, they can craft banners and reset. Obviously, this is not an ideal scenario, but when the benefits outweigh the risk, then they are more likely to take them. Now, I don't think we'll see this as commonly in like a regional final or towards the end of the season when certain teams are on the bubble, but I think as we get later into the season and certain teams need to get a lot of kills to recover, I think we're going to see this Conduit support passive be used as a heavy crutch to allow for teams to take really big risks in the early game. Now that we've established all of the things that Conduit brings to the table, here are the ways that Conduit kind of hurts the competitive meta. For one, edge teams can't really afford not to run Conduit. The HP difference and the resource difference that Conduit provides simply makes it that there's no other legend that can compete at the same level. Zone teams can still benefit, but not as much. Watson and other niche legends can accomplish better benefits depending on the comp and playstyle. But in terms of edge or teams running flex edge, playing the Conduit is going to be nearly essential for them. Otherwise, they risk being run down by a different Conduit team. In addition to this, any team that wants to take a new POI is going to be forced to play Conduit, meaning that teams that normally wouldn't play Conduit, such as TSM, might be forced to swap if a team starts landing on them. If Conduit remains in the meta all the way to land, then I think Conduit's pick rate is going to skyrocket simply due to the fact that these behemoth teams that are dominating better POIs in other regions are going to have to fight for those POIs. Conduit's going to be essential for those POIs to be taken. Conduit's going to be a legend that you're almost going to have to pick if you're worried about a team landing on you and contesting you, which means that those flex dropping teams that don't have a POI to call home are going to make more teams have to play Conduit or else risk being landed on by them. Because if there's a team that's at the bottom of the barrel and has nothing to lose, what's to stop them from landing on a TSM when they have Conduit and have an extra 100 HP off drop? To give them the advantage to potentially beat out the best team and get the best POI for that match. Sure, this isn't something that's always going to happen, but it is something that Conduit creates and an imbalance that Conduit creates in the game. It changes the way that teams have to play out of POIs, it makes so that edge teams have to play Conduit, and it makes so that zone teams have to watch out for Conduit teams landing to contest them. In addition to this, Conduit just creates longer engagements. There's more HP, which means that there's more time taken to deplete that HP. The ultimate also works as a zoning ability that can stall fights, and because the counter meta involves just running slower time to kill weapons, this means that the general fight's going to take longer than it normally did. There's more likelihood for third parties, and due to less commitment in the early game fights, more teams are going to be willing to do those third parties in favor of early KP, even if it's at the sacrifice of a good rotation. So does Conduit need to be nerfed? Let's talk first about her strongest ability, Radiant Transfer. Her tactical changes the flow of fights. This is a concern that a lot of pros have also expressed, simply because of the fact that it denies the ability for teams to push on the advantage that they've gained on a worse team. It's forgiving to mistakes. If you crack an opponent, normally this gives you the advantage to push while they're popping a shield battery. However, due to the Radiant Transfer, they're able to re-peek while their shield is still regenning. That's a forgiving ability that allows for people to take peeks they normally wouldn't take damage they normally wouldn't be able to survive from, and still be able to output damage against the team pushing in the open. Obviously, that's bad, as we discussed before, simply due to the fact that it slows engagements, it increases early to mid-game third parties, and it worsens endgames. It makes macro rotations harder to predict, simply due to the over-aggression of lobbies, and it decreases the amount of full squads and end zones, as not every team is going to be able to reset even if they took that gamble. So how would you nerf Radiant Transfer? For one, I would make her more of a support legend like she claims to be. Make her Radiant Transfer not work on herself, make it work either only regenerating one teammate, or if that's too harsh, it can regenerate both, but not herself. Make the Radiant Transfer stop and instantly go away if she's knocked. She should ideally be taking the least amount of damage unless the team is making a note to focus her, which should be something that the other team should be rewarded for doing. It increases the need for her to stay up while in fights. In addition to this, I think if you take damage while your shield is regenerating, your shield should never be able to regenerate further, even if you take cover again and stop taking damage for that 2-second period. This increases the skill gap and forces you to take a conscious decision on how long to play cover for your shield to regenerate. It already has the benefit of saving shield economy while you're in fights, and it allows for you to repeak faster, but if you take the risk of repeaking too early, then you should run the risk of losing some of that shield regeneration. I believe if you shield, whether it's a shield battery or a shield cell, as soon as that has replenished some of your shield, the temporary HP should stop regenerating. You should be allowed to have whatever has regenerated until that time, but I think any additional should be stopped because it already served the purpose it was meant to serve, which is to provide you cover while you regenerated that shield. Anything past that seems like an unnecessary benefit that's beyond its intended purpose. Moving past the Radiant Transfer, let's talk about what's balanced about the legend. And I think the ultimate is a very balanced part of her kit. If I were to make any discussions on potential improvements to her ultimate, I would say that at most, maybe a little bit less pylon health could be beneficial. Something that is a little bit easier to one clip with the average magazine of an SMG or a shotgun. I think 180 to 200 HP could be a good mark, or if the developers are not willing to lower it to that amount, then maybe less HP if you destroy it before the actual pylons activate. Something similar to the way that the gas traps work for Caustic. Addition to this is you could also just buff Caustic's ultimate to make him a good endgame substitute as well, because Caustic's ult is basically the same thing, just worse. I also think if you really want to nitpick, you could also lower the tick damage to maybe 8 or 9 damage per tick instead of 10. If you want to get into indirect ways to nerf Conduit, a few ways that I would suggest are starting with raising the cost of medkits and banners in the crafter. This is because it punishes more the ability to take risk in the early to mid game because the cost of resetting is going to be much higher. Maybe make medkits 30 or 35 crafting materials. And another idea that I had was maybe each banner individually costs 30. So if both teammates are down, you can craft both for 60 if you have it, or only one for 30 if you don't. Additionally, if only one teammate is down, the banner would only cost 30 instead. This increases the early game risk for fights because the cost of resetting is going to be higher, and this increases the amount of inside the ring penalties that teams receive, forcing them to rotate to zone a little bit earlier. Everyone might not prefer this and prefer to see more early game fights. I'm not against this either, but I do think it's limiting if only one support legend in the class supports this playstyle. And lastly, another indirect nerf that they could do is increase the AR or LMG meta. I think that buffing LMGs would be a good way to counter Conduit simply due to the uptime debate. If light machine guns were suddenly better to use and more reliable in fights, then it would increase the uptime across the board for all characters, which would make Conduit less useful when referencing uptime discussions like what Raven has mentioned. ARs could also achieve this same goal, but either way, I think something with a larger magazine being buffed would be a significant benefit for teams that are not necessarily willing to run Conduit, or just teams looking to deal with it. In the meantime, however, Conduit is here, and Conduit is in the meta, so here are ways that I think we'll see players start to deal with it. For one, if you're looking to embrace the meta, legends that partner well with Conduit are Bangalore. Her smokes allow for aggressive pushes, denying info for aggressive pushes against you. They makeshift cover, allowing for the Radiant Transfer to activate, and the smokes obscure energy barricades for the pylons, which increase the amount of time that the pylons are able to stay up, simply due to the fact that enemy teams can't see the pylon to shoot it out. Then there's also her rotation utility with the smokes, and the ability to damage the enemy's barricades with her ultimate, which makes them easier to destroy, and it denies the enemy's ability to play within her own barricades. The next legend that pairs well with Conduit is Horizon, obviously. Her tactical allows for easy aggression to play off of Conduit's aggressive playstyle, as well as passing over enemy barricades and evasion for the Radiant Transfer to activate. Catalyst being the last of the 4 legends discussed that are profoundly in the meta, her ultimate also provides the rotation utility that Bangalore does, while also providing the makeshift cover for Radiant Transfer as well. Her ability to get ring console also means that you can play more of a flex play with Conduit, allowing you to get to end zones where Conduit shines the most. Catalyst ultimate used in tandem with Conduit's ultimate can be used to obscure the energy barricades, which increases the amount of time that the barricades are able to stay up while still doing damage through the Catalyst wall. This can deny pushes in a much more aggressive way and increases your end zone control by a significant portion. Being able to take basically half the end zone to yourself and dealing damage to anyone in a significant manner that would try to pass through you, stunning them and blinding them in the process. The next legend that I have is starting to enter the meta a little more amidst the Bangalore meta, which is Bloodhound. Bloodhound doesn't play symbiotically with Conduit in the way that the previous legends have, but I do think we'll see more Bloodhound amidst this meta as long as Bangalore stays in play, because of the amount of aggression that Bloodhound brings, as addition to the recon scan, which is being very underutilized in this meta. If you're playing aggressive as a Conduit, looking to take early game fights, increase your KP, and level up your Evo armors, Bloodhound is going to be a significant advantage in your playstyle, and plays off very well with Conduit in that sense. Combo that with the Bangalore or Horizon, and you have a recipe for success in edge playstyle, as you're going to be able to find teams and take isolated fights, reduce your risk of third parties, and find your way to end zone in the late game with the recon scan. The last legend I think could start to enter the meta if people start to realize the benefit that he brings, and that's Gibby. Gibby's reset utility allows you to take aggressive fights in the edge playstyles and allows for aggressive pushes in a way that most other legends don't with his Dome Shield. When discussing increased uptime, which is one of the biggest debates surrounding Conduit's kit, Gibby also has HP in his arm shield, providing more damage that Gibby is able to tank. When comboing that with his fortified passive, which reduces the amount of damage that he takes per bullet, he's not only one of the legends able to stay in a fight the longest, but he also has an added effective HP buff from the Radiant Transfer in that same sense. The last thing that Gibby also brings to the table in combination with Conduit is that when you use the Gibby bubble with an energy barricade inside of it, it can actually deny space within the bubble, denying teams from pushing you in the endgame. Gibby also provides further endgame control with his ultimate, meaning that in an end zone, Gibby could ultimate the entire end zone, pop a Gibby bubble, and Conduit ult inside it, denying space both inside the bubble and out. Other ways that you can take advantage of this Conduit meta while we have it are to follow Raven's lead here. Raven mentions the discussion of uptime and says that one of the best ways that you can gain better uptime in fights is securing better POIs. The better loot you have, the more uptime you can have in fights. Better armors, better magazines, and better guns. Better edge POIs is also a solution if you're a fighting team. Farming crafters is going to be more important than it's ever been in this season. Securing an area with a high spawn rate or an area with easy rotates to weaker POIs that also have crafters is going to be essential for edge teams to be successful. I recommend Down Beast and Echo HQ on Stormpoint, and Stacks Mod and Climatizer on World's Edge. POIs like C-Note, Thermal Station, and Northpad are good, but in my opinion, they're too spread out to loot efficiently for the early game fights that you're going to need in this current meta. Conduit is geared towards high kill aggressive games. If you can't output high turnover in fights and take advantage of zones when they pull to you, you're better off just playing zone and taking a hard zone POI in this meta like Landslide or Jurassic, if you don't have the ability to fight for the POIs you want. The last recommendation I have is Contest. This is one of the most forgiving metas to contest with. Pick up Cat, Horizon, and Conduit, and go fight for Siphon, Cedo, or Pylon. The reset ability in ALGS is more viable than it's potentially ever been, meaning you can lose a contest and still place well on the day. So use that chance to put pressure on teams that are not running Conduit on better POIs. I think we could start seeing teams doing this to teams like TSM if they start to do worse. Because better POIs more central on the map are more likely to not have a Conduit on their team if they're uncontested, a strong fighting team running a Conduit could really get an advantage by landing on those teams and taking advantage of the HP difference off drop. So I think that the current meta is better than it's ever been to be able to contest mid ALGS and I think we could see some real success for a flex dropping playstyle for Conduit during the season. I think we'll also see this predatory nature big time in the challenger circuit as teams are taking advantage of their fighting to drop on teams that are unsuspecting and play more heavy zone. And the last thing I would recommend is try playing double assault rifle or marksman assault rifle because of the benefit that it has for uptime. There's a reason that TSM is doing so well with it, so it definitely is worth a try having at least one player on the team running that. But I think we'll also see teams trying to counter the meta, and here are some ways I think Conduit can be countered, whether she is in the comp or not in the comp. If you have a good POI, then Raven has spoken well on what you need to do to counter the meta, so I won't speak too much into that. In terms of legend counters, however, here are some that I would consider to counter the Conduit in the meta. The first is Loba. Loba has the same reset potential in terms of crafting and being a support legend with that passive, but her ultimate provides the better loot that is essential for gaining uptime. This means if you flex or lean towards zone, Loba could be a good alternative to you simply because you can get to zone and still get the better loot that you need for uptime in the late game, while also providing the shield economy as well. Watson provides similar utility in that same regard, allowing for a team to poke and preserve shields, but in addition to this, has a lot of zone control in the late game and can deny endgame energy barricades with her pylon. Crypto's also a big one if you can get to endgame, in addition to being one of the few legends that can hit Survey Beacon that's still being used. Crypto can also deal significant shield damage and destroy all energy barricades in an end zone situation with his ultimate. Getting a Crypto team to the end game means that you could basically deny all Conduit's utility in the end zone and win the game. Imagine all enemy utility simply gone, and then you also have a Conduit to pop an ultimate, or a Gibby to pop an ultimate, or simply outloot them because of a Loba. This one's a little more niche, but I could see Mad Maggie entering the fray simply due to the fact that her tactical denies cover for Radiant Transfer and allows for teams to still push an advantage that they might have in a fight without having to be worried about shield regeneration. Fuse can accomplish something similar with his knuckle clusters as well, but when I get to Mad Maggie's ultimate, I think that'll make it clear why I think Mad Maggie's the better pick. Her Q can deny space within the pylons, denying teams the ability to play off of them if the pylon is shot directly with her tactical. Lastly, her ultimate destroys the energy barricades pylons. Fortunately though, when I tested her Wrecking Ball, it only destroys the first pylon it makes contact with, which will clear enough space for you to push through, but it still funnels you into a choke. Ultimately, I think another way that they could indirectly nerf Conduit is by making it so the Wrecking Ball keeps going when it goes through pylons. I think that would be a better change for Mad Maggie, make her kit more useful, as well as make a better viable counter to the Conduit meta. Horizon, obviously, as I stated before, her lift can take you over the team's pylons, and her ultimate nades can kind of deny Radiant Transfer due to the amount of pressure it puts. But lastly, and I think this is one of the biggest underrated picks to counter the Conduit meta, is Gibby. Gibraltar's uptime in fights, as I discussed before, is something that can't be understated, as well as the fact that as long as pylons aren't within Gibby's bubble, the AoE damage does not hit inside the bubble, which means that a well-placed bubble can allow you to pass through a Conduit ultimate without taking any damage, or allow you to take space in an end zone without having to worry about the Conduit's ultimate affecting you. Additionally to this, an ultimate deals significant damage to the energy barricade pylons as well. It does not do enough to destroy them, but it will make it so that only a few bullets should be enough to do the rest. The end zone control that Gibby has could make him a really viable option, as well as his aggression in the early game and his reset capabilities, being both a support legend as well as his Gibby bubble for fast revives. I think that Gibraltar being played on the right team that plays flex or edge could be significantly successful, and a combination I'd like to see that I think would be really fascinating would be a Gibby Bloodhound Conduit or a Gibby Horizon Conduit. Though I could see an argument being made to swap out any of those for a Bang or a Cat, who are also just heavily in the meta for a reason. Now, I didn't talk about Horizon, Cat, or Bang too much in this video, simply because this video was talking about Conduit's effect in the meta, but those are all topics that I would like to cover in a future video, as long as they are not nerfed in a future patch. But this video series is intended to discuss the meta in ALGS, not just in reference to legends, but also in terms of weapons, attachments, maps, and POIs, as well as a lot of other things that are relevant. If you have an idea for a video on something meta that I can add to the future of the series, comment it below, because I'm always looking for ideas on videos to make. And if this is a series that you like, let me know, because it was really fun to make and research, and I would definitely like to keep doing it. All in all, Conduit's a strong legend that has a lot to offer, and as the season progresses, I think we have a lot more to see from her. So that's been it for this episode of The Meta. Once again, I'm Burke, and I'll see you next time.